You think you're making your own choices, but Jung discovered that most of what you call your personality is actually a collection of borrowed reactions, inherited emotions, and unconscious imitations. The scariest part? The trap is designed to feel like freedom, which is exactly why most people never try to escape. Before we dive deep into this psychological trap that Jung predicted would consume modern society, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to bring you more content about the fascinating world of psychology and the human psyche. What Jung discovered about human psychology was both brilliant and terrifying. He realized that most people live their entire lives without ever meeting their authentic selves. Instead, they become walking collections of other people's expectations, societal programming, and unconscious patterns that they mistake for their own personality. Jung called this the persona trap, and he predicted it would become the defining psychological crisis of the modern world. Think about your daily life for a moment. How many of your reactions are actually yours? When you get angry, are you feeling your own anger? Or are you replaying anger patterns you learned from your parents? When you feel anxious about success, is that your authentic concern? Or are you channeling inherited fears about standing out? When you choose what to wear, what to eat, how to speak, how much of that is genuinely you versus unconscious imitation of others? Jung observed that human beings are incredibly sophisticated copying machines. From the moment we're born, we're absorbing emotional patterns, behavioral templates, and psychological responses from everyone around us. Our parents, teachers, friends, media figures, even strangers on the street, contribute to this massive database of borrowed identity that we carry around and mistake for ourselves. The persona in Jung's framework is the mask we wear to navigate social situations. It's not inherently bad. We need personas to function in different contexts. You probably have a work persona, a family persona, a social persona. The problem arises when you become so identified with these masks that you forget there's a real person underneath them. Jung predicted that modern society would create conditions where this identification with persona becomes almost inevitable. He saw that as life became more complex, more social, more interconnected, people would need more sophisticated masks to navigate all their different roles and relationships. Eventually, the masks would become so elaborate and so necessary that people would lose touch with whatever authentic self existed beneath them. This is exactly what has happened. We live in a world where you can curate your entire identity through social media, where you're constantly performing different versions of yourself for different audiences, where success often depends on how well you can adapt your persona to meet external expectations. The trap has become so sophisticated that it feels like self-expression when it's actually self-suppression. But here's what makes this trap so insidious. It doesn't feel like a trap. When you're living through borrowed emotions and inherited patterns, it feels normal, even comfortable. You have explanations for your reactions, justifications for your choices, stories about who you are and why you do what you do. The persona provides a sense of identity and continuity that feels real because you've never experienced anything else. Jung realized that most people never question whether their emotional responses are authentically theirs because they've never experienced authentic emotion. If you've been angry in the same way your father was angry since you were 5 years old, that anger feels like you. If you've been anxious in the same way your mother was anxious since childhood, that anxiety seems like your natural response. The borrowed becomes so familiar that it feels more real than anything original could. This is why Jung called it a trap, rather than just a mistake or a phase. Traps are designed to be difficult to escape. They use your own energy against you. In this case, the very effort you put into maintaining and perfecting your persona makes it harder to access whatever authentic self might exist underneath it. Consider how this plays out in relationships. You meet someone, and you present your best persona. They're attracted to that persona and respond with their own carefully crafted mask. You fall in love with each other's performances, get married, and then spend years wondering why you feel disconnected and unfulfilled. Neither of you has ever met the real person you're living with because neither of you has ever met yourselves. Or think about career choices. How many people choose professions based on what they think they should want, rather than what they actually want? How many spend decades climbing ladders that lead to destinations they never consciously chose? The persona makes these choices feel reasonable, even inevitable, because it's designed to seek approval and avoid conflict, rather than pursue authentic fulfillment. Jung observed that this persona trap creates a particular kind of suffering that's almost impossible to identify or articulate. It's the suffering of living a life that fits you perfectly on the outside, but feels empty on the inside. It's the suffering of being successful at being someone you're not. It's the suffering of getting everything you thought you wanted and discovering that you don't actually want it. This suffering is particularly cruel because it's invisible to others and often invisible to yourself. From the outside, your life might look perfect. You're meeting expectations, fulfilling roles, achieving goals. But inside, there's a persistent sense that something is missing, that you're not quite real, that you're going through the motions of a life rather than actually living one. Jung predicted that this would become epidemic in modern society because modern life requires so much persona management. You need different masks for work, family, social media, dating apps, professional networks, casual friendships. Each context demands a slightly different version of yourself, and maintaining all these versions requires enormous psychological energy. The more energy you invest in persona maintenance, the less energy is available for authentic self-discovery. You become so busy being who you think you should be that you never have time or space to discover who you actually are. The trap feeds on itself, becoming stronger and more elaborate with each passing year. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this trap is how it affects your relationship with your own emotions. When you're constantly managing how you appear to others, you start managing how you appear to yourself. You learn to feel what you think you should feel, rather than what you actually feel. You develop sophisticated internal censorship systems that filter out any emotional responses that don't fit your persona. This emotional filtering happens so automatically that you don't realize it's occurring. You might think you're a calm person when you're actually someone who has learned to suppress anger so effectively that you can't access it, even when it would be appropriate. You might think you're independent when you're actually someone who has learned to hide dependency, need so completely that you can't ask for help, even when you desperately need it. Jung saw that this disconnection from authentic emotion would create what he called a collective neurosis. Entire societies of people who are performing emotional responses rather than experiencing them, who are reacting from borrowed patterns rather than genuine feeling, who are living scripted lives rather than authored ones. The tragedy is that underneath all these layers of persona and borrowed identity, there is an authentic self waiting to be discovered. Jung called this the true self, or the individuated self. It's not a fixed identity, but rather a dynamic, creative, evolving expression of your unique essence. But accessing this authentic self requires something that the persona trap makes almost impossible: the willingness to disappoint others and risk social rejection. This is where the trap becomes most vicious. The persona exists to gain approval and avoid rejection. The authentic self, by definition, cannot be designed to please others because it emerges from your own inner truth rather than external expectations. To access your authentic self, you have to be willing to let go of the very thing that has provided your sense of safety and identity throughout your life. Jung understood that most people would never make this choice because the risk feels too great. What if you discover that your authentic self is unacceptable to others? What if your real emotions are too intense, too strange, too inconvenient? What if your genuine desires conflict with your responsibilities? What if the person you really are is someone that the people you love can't love back? These fears keep people trapped in personas that feel increasingly hollow but continue to provide the illusion of safety. You know something is wrong, but you can't quite identify what it is. You feel disconnected from your own life, but you can't imagine how to change it without losing everything you've built. You sense that you're not being authentic, but authenticity feels too dangerous to pursue. Jung predicted that this would create a society of people who are simultaneously overconnected and profoundly lonely, constantly performing but never truly seen, achieving external success while experiencing internal emptiness. Does this sound familiar? This is the world we're living in right now. The persona trap has become so sophisticated that it can even co-opt the language of authenticity and self-discovery. You can develop a spiritual persona, a therapeutic persona, even a rebellious persona that feels like freedom, but is actually just another mask. You can spend years in therapy, meditation, or personal development work while still remaining fundamentally trapped in borrowed patterns and inherited responses. This is why Jung emphasized that escaping this trap requires more than just insight or understanding. It requires what he called individuation, a process of gradually differentiating between what is authentically yours and what you've absorbed from others. This process is necessarily slow, often uncomfortable, and always involves the risk of disappointing people who have become attached to your persona. So how do you actually escape this emotional trap that Jung predicted would consume modern society? The answer is both simpler and more complex than most people expect, and it requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own identity. The first step Jung identified is what he called conscious suffering. This means becoming aware of the gap between who you appear to be and who you actually are, and allowing yourself to feel the discomfort of that recognition. Most people, when they start to sense this gap, immediately try to fix it by adjusting their persona or finding new ways to feel authentic within their existing patterns. But Jung discovered that this discomfort is actually the beginning of freedom, not a problem to be solved. Conscious suffering involves sitting with the recognition that much of what you call your personality might not actually be yours. This is profoundly unsettling because it challenges the very foundation of your sense of self. Who are you, if not your reactions, your preferences, your emotional patterns, your ways of thinking and responding? Jung's answer was both terrifying and liberating. You are whoever emerges when you stop trying to be anyone in particular. This emergence doesn't happen through effort or willpower. In fact, trying to force authenticity usually just creates a new, more sophisticated persona. Instead, it happens through what Jung called active imagination and shadow work. You begin to notice the parts of yourself that your persona has been hiding or suppressing, and you start to develop a relationship with these rejected aspects. For example, if your persona is built around being helpful and agreeable, you might start to notice the anger, selfishness, or criticism that you've been suppressing. Instead of judging these qualities or trying to eliminate them, you begin to explore them with curiosity. What are they trying to tell you? What needs are they expressing? How might they serve your authentic development if they were integrated rather than rejected? This process is particularly challenging because it often reveals that your persona has been built around rejecting precisely the qualities that are most essential to your authentic self. The person who has built their identity around being rational might discover that their emotional nature is their greatest gift. The person who has built their identity around being independent might discover that their capacity for intimacy is their deepest longing. Jung observed that this discovery process often triggers what he called the dark night of the soul, a period where your old identity no longer works, but your new identity hasn't yet emerged. This is perhaps the most dangerous phase of escaping the persona trap because the temptation to retreat back into familiar patterns is enormous. You know who you were, even if it felt hollow. You don't yet know who you're becoming, and the uncertainty can feel unbearable. During this phase, Jung emphasized the importance of what he called holding the tension. Instead of rushing to resolve the discomfort by choosing a new identity or reverting to an old one, you learn to live in the space between identities. You practice not knowing who you are while remaining open to whatever wants to emerge. This requires developing a different relationship with uncertainty and discomfort. Most people have been trained to see uncertainty as a problem to be solved, and discomfort as a signal that something is wrong. But in the individuation process, uncertainty becomes a creative space, and discomfort becomes information about what's trying to be born. One of the most practical tools Jung developed for this process is what he called amplification. This involves paying attention to the images, dreams, fantasies, and spontaneous responses that arise when you're not trying to manage your persona. These spontaneous expressions often contain clues about your authentic nature that your conscious mind has been overlooking or suppressing. For instance, you might notice that you're drawn to certain types of art, music, or literature that don't fit your persona. You might have recurring dreams about activities or environments that seem unrelated to your conscious life. You might find yourself having emotional responses to situations that surprise you. Instead of dismissing these as random or irrelevant, you begin to treat them as communications from your authentic self. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called active imagination, a process of engaging in dialogue with the different aspects of your psyche. This might involve writing conversations between your persona and your shadow, or between your conscious self and the parts of you that feel most foreign or unacceptable. Through these dialogues, you begin to understand the different voices within you and how they might work together rather than in conflict. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of escaping the persona trap is learning to tolerate disapproval and rejection from others. Your persona was built to gain approval and avoid conflict. As you begin to express more authentic aspects of yourself, some people will be uncomfortable, confused, or even hostile. They were attached to your persona, and your authenticity might feel like a betrayal or a threat. Jung observed that this social pressure is often what keeps people trapped, even after they've begun to recognize their authentic nature. The fear of losing relationships, professional opportunities, or social status can feel more threatening than the emptiness of living inauthentically. But he also discovered that the relationships and opportunities that depend on your persona are ultimately unsatisfying because they're not based on who you actually are. The people who can love and appreciate your authentic self are often different from the people who were attracted to your persona. This means that individuation often involves a natural sorting process where some relationships deepen and others fall away. This can be painful, but Jung saw it as necessary for genuine connection and fulfillment. As you begin to live more authentically, you'll also notice that your emotional responses become more immediate and less predictable. Instead of having standard reactions to standard situations, you start responding freshly to each moment, based on what's actually happening, rather than what you think should be happening. This can feel chaotic at first, especially if you've been relying on emotional predictability to feel safe. Jung called this process emotional differentiation. You begin to distinguish between emotions that are authentically yours and emotions that you've inherited or learned. Your anger becomes different from your father's anger. Your sadness becomes different from your mother's sadness. Your joy becomes uniquely yours rather than a performance of what happiness should look like. This differentiation often reveals that your authentic emotional range is both broader and more nuanced than your persona allowed. You might discover capacities for feeling that you didn't know you had, or you might realize that emotions you thought were fundamental to your personality were actually borrowed responses that never quite fit. One of the most surprising aspects of this process is how it affects your relationship with success and achievement. When you're living through persona, success feels necessary because it validates your performance. When you begin to live authentically, success becomes less important than alignment. You start making choices based on what feels true rather than what looks good, and this often leads to unexpected forms of fulfillment. Jung observed that people who successfully escape the persona trap often experience what he called a second birth. They feel like they're meeting themselves for the first time, discovering preferences, talents, and desires that were hidden beneath layers of borrowed identity. This can be disorienting because it means that much of what you thought you knew about yourself was actually knowledge about your persona. But this second birth also brings a quality of aliveness and presence that's impossible to achieve through persona management. When you're being authentically yourself, you don't have to remember how to act or what to say. Your responses arise naturally from your genuine engagement with each moment. This creates a sense of flow and spontaneity that makes life feel more vivid and meaningful. The ultimate goal of escaping the persona trap isn't to eliminate all social adaptation or to become completely unfiltered in your expression. Jung understood that we need different aspects of ourselves for different situations. The goal is to develop conscious choice about how you present yourself rather than unconscious compulsion to maintain a fixed identity. When you're individuated, you can still be professional at work, nurturing with family, and playful with friends. But these different expressions arise from authentic aspects of your nature rather than from borrowed templates. You're not performing roles, you're expressing different facets of your genuine self. Jung also discovered that people who escape the persona trap often develop what he called a transpersonal perspective. They begin to see their individual authenticity as part of a larger pattern of human development. They understand that their personal liberation contributes to the collective liberation of humanity from inherited patterns and unconscious imitation. This perspective helps sustain the courage required for authentic living. When you understand that your individuation serves something larger than your personal comfort, it becomes easier to tolerate the discomfort and uncertainty that authentic development requires. You're not just freeing yourself, you're participating in the evolution of human consciousness. The final insight Jung offered about escaping the persona trap is perhaps the most important. Authenticity is not a destination, but a practice. You don't achieve individuation once and then maintain it effortlessly. You have to choose authenticity moment by moment, situation by situation, relationship by relationship. Each choice to express your genuine self rather than your persona strengthens your capacity for authentic living. This ongoing practice requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to be yourself, even when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unpopular. It means speaking your truth even when it might create conflict, following your genuine interests even when they don't make sense to others, and honoring your authentic emotions even when they're messy or inconvenient. As you develop this practice, you'll notice that the persona trap loses its power over you. You'll still feel the pull of old patterns and inherited responses, but you'll have the awareness and the tools to choose differently. You'll be able to recognize when you're performing rather than being, and you'll have the courage to return to authenticity. Remember, Jung predicted that most people would never escape this trap, not because it's impossible, but because it requires something that our culture doesn't teach, the willingness to disappoint others in service of your own truth. But for those who are willing to take this risk, the reward is nothing less than your own life, lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. The question Jung would ask you is this: are you ready to meet yourself? Are you ready to discover who you actually are beneath all the layers of borrowed identity and inherited patterns? Are you ready to live your own life rather than the life that others expect from you? The trap is only as strong as your willingness to remain inside it. Your freedom is always just one authentic choice away.